Ja, men den på? Det? Hello? Hello and good morning. Can you hear me in the back? Okay? Okay. Thank you. My name is Ole Jakob Sending. A warm welcome to this seminar organized by the Center for Geopolitics. We have more guests coming in, please. A special welcome to a class from Blindern High School. It's very good to see teenagers, students here with us today. Now, last week there was a presidential election and election for Congress in the US, as we know. There is a lot of uncertainty about what this means for the world, for Europe, and for the Nordic countries. Nonetheless, it should be possible, based on existing knowledge, to say a little bit about the direction of travel and what it may mean for the Nordic region and for the individual Nordic countries. So we've decided to use ourselves, the Nordic countries, as a prism to try to understand the likely consequences of a Trump presidency. And to discuss this, we have Kristin Haugevik, who will be moderating, research professor and director of research at NUPI, Björn Fagersten, senior research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, Andreas Forsby, senior research fellow at the Danish Institute for International Studies, Ida Maria Oma, associate professor at the Institute for Defense Studies, and Mikael Matlin, research professor and deputy director of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And with that, I will leave it to you and remind everyone that the event is being streamed. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you and welcome. It's happy and a pleasure to see so many people present in the room today to discuss and have a little look into the crystal ball, what is expecting us in these next 4 years. When Donald Trump came to power 8 years ago in January 2017, we didn't really know what to expect. He had run an unusual election campaign against Hillary Clinton. His rhetoric was unlike anything we had seen from previous American presidential candidates. But at the same time, many were discussing at the time that maybe it would be a bit different when he came into office. Maybe his politics would be recognizable. Maybe they would be in a form that was known for us in previous presidents of the United States. His apparatus consisted of people that weren't as known. Some of them were part of what we may call the establishment, whereas others were more undescribed. So there was a mix of conventional expertise, people like James Mattis, who was defense minister, and then more unconventional figures, if we may call them that, people like Steve Bannon, who aimed to disrupt the traditional way of doing politics in Washington. But nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that throughout his presidency, Trump pretty much stayed on message. So it was America first. That was something that was very clear during his presidency. And he also made quite a few fundamental changes to international politics while he was president. I think it's also fair to say that the Nordic states fared quite well under the first Trump administration. And this is, in a sense, the Nordic conduct, right? We respect elections. We work with whomever is elected, as long as the elections are free and fair. And I think this is especially true if it's the United States. That's the state in question, because the Nordic states have very strong ties with the United States, regardless of who is currently in power. So there's a sense of pragmatism as well in terms of how the Nordics relate to the United States. And also the Trump administration and Trump himself seemed to like the Nordics, even wanted to buy parts of the Nordics, right? So meeting Norway's Prime Minister Erna Solberg in 2018, Trump called Norway a good customer, ally and friend. And Solberg said Trump was nice and friendly, and he was clearly interested in learning more about Norway. So While expressing general concern about multilateral cooperation, international trade, and the Trump administration's climate policy, and so on, many Nordic leaders also emphasized that they worked quite well with the Trump administration, and especially in the area of security and defense, where Trump and his administration seem to take quite a bit interest in the Nordic states, and also developing good ties with the NATO Secretary General, of course, also from Norway, who had an ability, it was said, to speak to Trump and get on good terms with him. So Trump threatened to leave NATO. He asked the European NATO members to contribute more, and they also seemed to be quite understanding of this demand as well. Many of them trying, or Denmark and Norway trying to reach above the 2% target and being more explicit about that than they had been in the past. So the verdict, of course, when Trump's first term was coming to an end, some of the Nordic leaders was sort of very diplomatically saying that, well, one of the challenges was that Trump's policies were more unpredictable, as Ole Jakob also said in his introduction. And then the then Norwegian foreign minister also said that there had been a lot of noise during Trump's first presidency, but at the same time, ties had been pretty normal during those 4 years, nonetheless. Trump left the White House in January 2021, and since then we have had the Ukraine war. Finland and Sweden have become NATO members. Israel has gone to war on Gaza. There has been an increase in geopolitical rivalry, I would say. And there is a general trend that may not have started with Trump, but which was certainly amplified during his first term. But this trend has continued of what we may call deinstitutionalization, of multilateralism being under pressure, and of more tendencies of bi- and minilateral constellations, as well as ad hocism in international politics. So with Trump back, we don't yet know what to expect, but the unpredictability, I think, still applies. This time, Trump's team seems to come more prepared. So his appointments so far, the ones that we know about, seem to point in the directions of people who are supportive of the political program, who are loyalists in terms of Trump's ideas of what he wants to accomplish. And Trump himself may seem to have this time a clearer idea of what he wants to accomplish and what is possible, and also how to work the international political environment. But then again, also the Nordic states are more prepared than they were the last time around. I think it goes for all the Nordic states that they have spent these last months and years quite pragmatically and wisely. They have developed ties to both possible administrations. So they are prepared, and they have made their congratulatory calls. Trump, I think, have told the Norwegian Prime Minister that he is interested in developing the good bilateral ties, and I just assume that that would go for all the Nordic countries as well. So what we want to talk about today is what this looks like from the Nordic capitals, and are they similar in terms of how they evaluate the coming terms? Are they prepared for what is coming? What's going to happen to NATO? What's going to be the situation if Trump continues his trade war with China? What is going to be Europe's and the Nordic states' response if Trump decides to change the current US approach to the Ukraine war? So these are some of the questions. I think you will also raise different ones in your talks, but we look forward very much to hear from you. We will start with Sweden, and then we will move towards the direction of Finland in the end. But Björn, please let us know the view from Stockholm.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. Yes, well, the Swedish government, of course, as I think the other Nordic governments, didn't have an official favorite. Clearly, they would have most likely preferred another outcome, but here we are. I think there is, if we start with the there is both a worry about the areas where Trump are seen to be pretty unpredictable, as you indicated. perhaps possibly the relation to NATO, and most certainly the kind of the support for Ukraine, a key issue for Sweden. But there's also, I think, a slight worry for the areas where Trump is not so unpredictable, which is trade and economic security. He has held pretty kind of stable beliefs and articulated them since the mid-80s in his views on Japan, and then on Europe, Germany last time, and China now. The EU, the economic security policies of the US was essentially kind of beefed up and to some extent established under Trump when he was president, and the Biden administration has just continued on this line with some adaptations, a mix of export control, internal subvention, sanctions, etc. And most likely, and looking at the picks so far of administration officials, Trump will follow on this line and possibly increase pressure on China, but not only with tariffs on China, but also kind of global tariffs. He loves tariffs. It's a beautiful word we've heard. The same as with God and love. So that's the non-predictable side, which is kind of worrying from a Swedish and I guess Nordic perspective. And just to, like the red flags, the negatives here from a Swedish perspective, if we compare with, you said Norway, you were treated as, you were a great customer. Well, unfortunately, we are not. We run a 50% trade surplus against the US if we combine trading goods and services. If we take away services, because we actually buy quite a lot of American services, we have, I think, a trade surplus of about 250%. And the goods is really what Trump cares about, because that's what carries the industrial jobs in the Midwest. We don't buy any F-35s. So that's things that might make us worry and makes us less as kind of favorites. Also, the only thing that we actually, or not the only thing, but one thing we did buy quite a lot of is Teslas. But now they are under a blockade by the Swedish Union. So we'll see what Elon Musk thinks about that. On the positive side, we actually make huge US investments. I think we are the world's, or the 10th largest investor in the United States. And this is like a double, in the best of worlds, it's like a double hedge, because it means both that we buy goodwill, but also that we have resources, factories, etc., in the US. So that's also a way to evade tariffs by moving production to the US via our direct investments. So that's a good thing. We have a strong defense and kind of defense industry, high-tech sector. Ericsson, for example, was a card to play out last time when he was president. We have a geology in the term of critical rare earth minerals, a geography that is useful for Americans of any political sort, at least as long as they want to fulfill Article 5 and be serious about NATO. It's good to have access to Swedish territory. Another good thing is that we are EU members. It was 30 years yesterday. We entered the Union. I'm very happy about that. I was 14 and against, but I didn't have any influence. I'm happy about that. We joined anyway. And that's a source of stability today, which we are quite happy about. So just a few challenges before I end. First, I think right now there's a kind of at least in Sweden, people agree on the fact that Europe needs to take more responsibility for its own security. And that would have been the case regardless who won the US election. But I think possibly with the Trump administration, we might see again more friction in this issue, exactly how it will be done. If the Europeans need to spend much more and also to help Ukraine, some of that spending would most likely go through the European Union when it comes to defense industry programs, for example. They will not be always open to US involvement. That's a point of friction historically, and will be that again, I think, with the Trump presidency. But I think also within NATO, there could be slight tension. The Americans would likely want the Europeans to spend more on resources that kind of complement what the US brings to NATO, while the Europeans might want to hedge and actually establish some of these resources where the US is the sole provider today, like space, intelligence, etc. So that we might see some friction there. Finally, the Swedes have a challenge when it comes to we often hear our government, many members of the government say that we need to be loyal to US interests in the Indo-Pacific. especially as a new NATO member. We need to be sensitive and knowledgeable and kind of loyal in respect to US interests in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, that relates to the relations to China. Now, it's great that we want to be loyal, but if you look in practice, what does the US want from the Europeans in the Indo-Pacific? Well, it's not to send our tiny military resources there. It is essentially to be loyal in their economic security approach, to have the same kind of tariffs, to block the sales of the same technology, etc. And this is a bit of a dilemma for Sweden, because we want to be loyal, but we are die-hard free traders, and as soon as the European Union introduces any kind of mechanism that will block trade with China, whether it is tariffs on Chinese EVs or outbound investment control that is being discussed, Sweden is pretty hesitant about this because we believe in free trade. So the only area where the Americans really want our loyalty in relation to China, we are very skeptical, but we want to be loyal, and that's a bit of a challenge, and I think that will be even more so. Finally, what to do on a Nordic scale, and I'm sure we'll discuss more of this, but I think in the military dimension, the Arctic, we all have different sorts of resources to take more responsibility, be more active in the Arctic. This is also an area where we can plug in our space capabilities, which is also kind of a shared Nordic resource that we can use to be a more relevant partner to the US. I also think on actually economic security, there's more to do on a Nordic scale to share more information about vulnerabilities when it comes to investments in China, investments in the Nordic that could be of a sensitive nature, etc. Because this kind of information is very sensitive, and there's a problem of sharing it in larger settings, but whether you talk about the EU or NATO, so I think the Nordics would be a good platform to increase intelligence cooperation. That's another way where we can favor Nordic cooperation.
Quick follow-up question before we move on to Andreas. So now you talked a lot about, Björn, you talked about strategic interest, you talked about how sort of the Nordic states and Sweden could be useful for the US. But the last time around, when Trump was in power, Sweden had a government who specifically was leading a feminist foreign policy with sort of values very much up there. What is this looking like at the moment? Is it different this time around, also with Sweden having joined NATO? And also, is the value dimension, is that less of a question today?
Yeah, well, I mean, the line from the current government is that the policy is more or less untouched. We are still supporters of women's and girls' rights, for example, in different parts of the world. They don't frame it as feminist foreign policy anymore. To what extent that's actually a good thing with the Trump presidency, I'm not sure. I don't know if he is as focused on labels, but yeah, we'll see. On NATO, well, of course, we are happy to be NATO members, allies. It means some sort of stability. Also with non-American partners. I mean, since Brexit, we don't have really a security link as strong, at least with the UK. We have a bilateral one, but now we are in a framework where we can cooperate with both other Nordics and other Europeans, even if the US would show less commitment going forward. But of course, at the bottom end, like if the US would be less and less interested, of course, the value of the NATO decreases, but not to zero. It's still a good platform to work through.
Thank you. Andreas, we're going to move on to the Danish perspective, and I hope you're going to tell us more about also the offer to, are you willing to sell Greenland this time?
I will come back to that.
Price
Increased, of course, yeah. Thank you to NUPI for the invitation. Good to be here. So I'm a senior researcher in the Foreign Policy and Diplomacy Unit at DEAS. I'm focusing primarily on Chinese foreign and security policy, but I will start my opening remarks by focusing on how the Danish government views the Trump victory. So I should also observe from the outset that Danes are by far the most skeptical, if not outright dismissive, of Donald Trump. And I have yet to come across a single Danish Trump supporter, I can assure you. So there was this poll recently from, I think it was YouGov, which showed us that there were only 4% of Danes who would, hypothetically, of course, vote for Donald Trump in the American election. I think that since Swedes and Norwegians registered at 8, 10, and 12% respectively of Trump supporters, hypothetically, of course, again. So, irrespective of the Danish popular perceptions of Trump, I can assure you that the Danish government will accommodate itself to the whims and wishes of a new Trump administration. Our Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, has made a public show out of congratulating Donald Trump with his win. She noted that she was one of the very first European leaders to talk to Donald Trump. She had a 12 minutes long phone call with him. She knows him very well. Her previous spell as Prime Minister overlapped with that of Donald Trump back in 2017 to 21. And she even praised him for his insistence on increasing European defense spending. Indeed, based on the first Trump presidency, I think it's safe to assume that the Danish government will adapt to the new realities. To give you a few examples. So when Trump came into office in 2017, Denmark still prided itself of being the only Nordic and the smallest European country in Europe, European country to have a comprehensive strategic partnership with China. However, when the Trump administration midway into 2018 embarked on a far more confrontational approach towards China, the Danish government was very quick to follow suit, being, for instance, the first European country to make clear that Huawei would no longer, or it would be effectively banned from Denmark's digital infrastructure. And it was also intervening to curb China's investments in Greenland at the request of Trump's defense secretary, Jim Mattis. And when the Trump administration stated in unambiguous terms that NATO's security guarantee was predicated on increased European defense spending and called on NATO countries to reach the 2% mark, the Danish government, after decades of diversionary tactics, soon announced a specific plan for reaching that goal. And they did already in 2023 by, I should add, including the military support for Ukraine. Indeed, several observers have argued that Denmark stands out as the absolutely most pro-American or loyal country in Europe. And the current Danish Prime Minister famously observed that one shouldn't be able to inject a single piece of paper in between Copenhagen and Washington. There are, of course, good reasons for Denmark's accommodative position towards Washington. Not only has the US for decades been Denmark's most important defense treaty ally, America is also our single largest export market at 15%, 3 times bigger than our exports for the Chinese market. The US is even our largest foreign direct investor in Denmark, and was last year for the first time also the largest destination for FDI investments among Danish companies. And the list goes on. Denmark relies heavily on US tech companies that are providing the digital infrastructure for our workplaces as well as our social media. So it's no surprise that the Danish government has gone out of its way to congratulate Trump with his election victory, despite these negative popular views of him in Denmark. Does it mean that the Danish government has no concerns? Of course not, and let me just mention a few before I stop. So 2025 will see Denmark assume not only a non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council for a 2-year period, but also the presidency of the EU Council in the second half of that year. Trump's America First priorities and disruptive policies will undoubtedly make it more difficult for the Danish government to pursue its agenda, both in the EU and the UN Security Council. Second, Trump's eagerness for imposing additional tariffs on its imports from the rest of the world, and his contempt for the global climate and sustainability agenda are major concerns for a small and open economy as the Danish, which is investing heavily in the green transition these years. Third, Trump's seeming unwillingness to support Ukraine and Europe more broadly against Russian aggression is perhaps the biggest headache for Copenhagen. It was fear of Russian expansionism that prompted the Danish government last year to sign an unprecedented agreement with the Americans, allowing them to permanently place their military personnel and resources in 3 Danish air bases. Finally, the Danish government has certainly not forgotten, and I'll come back then to Greenland, the Trump administration's proposal back in 2019 to buy Greenland from Denmark, which created the most serious rift in relations between the Trump administration and Denmark. Indeed, this is exactly the kind of erratic unpredictability that is likely to keep the Danish government awake at night during the next Trump administration. And the very reason the Danish government is increasingly hedging its geostrategic position by not only sticking to its accommodative policies towards Washington, but also calling for Brussels to play a larger role in giving up Denmark's long-standing EU defense opt-out back in 2022. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Andreas. And just picking up on your last point, does this mean that Denmark's traditional description of Denmark is as the super Atlanticist among the Nordics, right?
Yes.
Does this mean that we see a slight change in that from what you were saying with the stronger orientation towards the EU, as well as perhaps a stronger Danish investments in the Nordic aspect, for example?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that the Danish government will not really be giving up on its loyalty to the US. As I talked, there are so many dependencies on the US. It's of course also obvious, as I talked about when I mentioned the strategic hedging, that we will increasingly reorient our priorities towards Brussels as well. I think we'll play on two horses, if you can use that expression in English. We are talking increasingly about strategic autonomy at a EU scale, and the most recent Danish defense and foreign policy strategy paper was very clear in putting the EU at the center of Danish foreign policy priorities to a much larger extent than what we have previously seen. But I mean, when push comes to shove, we are very dependent on the US, as I mentioned, in so many respects, geopolitically, security-wise, technologically, geoeconomically. So I think it will be a slow wake-up call. I mean, the first Trump administration, some were considering to be an aberration, like we came back to what we presume to be a normal way of US presidencies, but now I think we are under no illusions no longer that this is this is not what the US represents. I think this MAGA move and the turn to America first is much more deeply rooted now, and of course the Danish government will have to adjust its overall strategic priorities to these new realities, and this is what is gradually taking hold, I think, in the awareness of the Danish government in the past few weeks, as we saw Trump rising in the opinion polls and all that. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Ida Maria, I know, and I'm looking forward to, because you are going to talk a bit about the security and defense aspects, especially from the Norwegian point of view, and all these NATO questions that we have, I think many of us in the room today. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this panel. Yes, I will share a few thoughts on the implications for NATO, for Norwegian security policy, and the Nordic cooperation. But I feel inclined to first note that it remains to be seen how Trump's at times very harsh rhetoric will actually play out in practice. And I also would like to emphasize that the Trump factor will not explain it all. For instance, regardless of the election outcome, we would know that the US would continue to prioritize the power rivalry with China, and that Europe needs to assume more responsibility for its own security. Nevertheless, the second Trump presidency, I would say, presents great risks to transatlantic alliance relationships. But let me start with on the bright side for NATO. The alliance is better prepared for both collective defense and American burden-sharing demands than the last time Trump was elected. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has reinvigorated the alliance, created unity and purpose, enhanced efforts to adapt defense plans, and fulfilling these forces under a revised command structure. and last but not least, united the Nordic region as NATO members. And this year, most European allies will reach the 2% in defense spending that Trump elevated to the hallmark of burden sharing during his first presidency. His re-election provides a clear incentive to keep or pick up the pace in defense spending and adaptation efforts. This would increase the chances of a continued US commitment to NATO, although a drawdown in American forces in Europe can nevertheless be expected. But it would also help and strengthen the European pillar of the alliance and eventually contribute to reduce dependence on American initiatives and assets. While on the gloomy side, Trump is a NATO skeptic by heart, is better prepared and less constrained this time for executing his visions for America first. But I don't think we'll see a formal US withdrawal from the alliance, but much harm can be done regardless. A relationship with allies that is transactional and unpredictable in nature is generally a bad mix for deterrence credibility. And among the potential crises in the years to come, the issue of continued support to Ukraine will of course be an immediate test for the transatlantic alliance. So what about Norway? Norwegian deterrence and defense is fundamentally based on NATO and its Article 5, with the US as its main grantor and Norway's closest ally. So there is nothing to suggest that the Norwegian government is contemplating a departure from this 25-year-old path or considers there to be any realistic alternatives. Even in the case of an abrupt American disengagement from NATO, a solid base for the bilateral relationship will exist due to Norway's strategic location near the Kola Peninsula. But the NATO framework is vital for securing Norwegian security interests. Norway reaches the 2% target this year and has launched an ambitious long-term plan for defense, including an increase in defense spending with 600 billion kroner over the next 12 years. I think a Trump effect on defense spending can actually come in handy in securing continued support for this level of funding over time. And given the likely Trump effects on American support to Ukraine, I think that Norway should also step up its own support now. And I also believe that Norway should further develop a cobweb of integration in Northern Europe to reduce the risks of being overly dependent on an ally that is drifting apart in terms of a strategic outlook and shared values. And we can do more together with our Nordic allies. After the main constraint of Swedish and Finnish non-membership of NATO has been removed. But time is running out, so I'll spare the details for the discussion. But a couple of remarks. The Nordic countries, I would say, are in a unique position together to demonstrate that small states can take significant responsibility for national and regional security. And the reduced American presence in Europe is likely to be felt also in training and exercises in the Nordic region. And the final point is related to Trump's preference for deal-making diplomacy in bilateral channels. It could be tempting to engage in a beauty contest, promoting national rather than Nordic contributions and burden sharing, but there is probably more to gain for all in striving for security policy coordination and joint positions.
Thank you, Ida Maria. And just to pick up on that last point, because we know many American presidents, not just the Trump administration, they are, from a small state perspective, you have to bring something to the table because they are sought after, their time is limited, you have to be relevant in a way to ask for meeting and to ask for access. So what would you say now is Norway's comparative advantage in terms of bringing something to the table, and in terms of this bilateralism that you mentioned has been a trademark of Trump's during his first term, where he very often relied on bilateral agreements and meetings and discussions, and seemed to prefer that over the multilateral settings?
It's definitely related to the point I briefly mentioned, namely Norway's strategic location close to the Kola Peninsula. Regardless of the NATO cooperation as such, it is a vital interest for the US to be able to pick up on the movements of strategic submarines located at the Kola bases. And Norwegian contributions in terms of being eyes and ears in the high north is in that regard a particular asset that Norway can bring to the table. So that, yes, is the main contribution. Russian knowledge is another aspect, now perhaps in competition with the Finnish. And now demonstrating that we are taking our defense spending seriously and strengthening all elements of the armed forces, to name just a few.
Thank you. And that is a very good bridge to you, Mikael, because Finland is in a very different situation now than it was when Trump came to power the first time. And please give us the perspective from Helsinki, which is in a very different state at the moment.
Indeed, thank you, Christine. So thank you very much for the invitation, and very nice to be here. A lot has been said already, and I'll try to give a little bit of a Finnish perspective and maybe also touch upon some broader themes that I expect or I'm observing now with the new coming second Trump presidency. Maybe just to start off with kind of a broader idea here. Just wrote a short note a few days ago on what this might entail for Trump's policy towards China and Taiwan, and what it means for us. And I had this thought that if you go back to what Andreas was saying here about how the Nordic countries are kind of top of the list of people who would have preferred perhaps to see another result. Well, often the most consequential American presidencies are not necessarily the ones that are the most popular ones in Europe, or let alone in the Nordic countries. As one just general idea to start off with. And I think actually, at least when it comes to Trump's policies, or with regard to China, for example, and Taiwan and geopolitics and so on, he really, in a way, put the cat on the table, as we say in Finland, during the first presidency. He shifted the debate on a lot of issues, and we're still very much living with the consequences. I think the fact that they've set up this center is one of those consequences. So the national security strategy in 2017 of the US shifted the focus towards China and Russia. It had been the war on terrorism for a long time before that. And then it became China very much more so than Russia, China being what they call the pacing challenge for the US. And that has brought all kinds of consequences. On a smaller level, I would say that even now, before taking up his or starting his second presidency, we've also already seen the effects of this, certainly in Finland as well. And just to give a very concrete example, so for the last 2.5 years, it's been very difficult publicly to talk about an outcome of the war in Ukraine that is not sort of what Ukraine would like to see it to be. This has been almost a taboo subject in the Finnish debate, and I think also in many other countries in Europe and the Nordics, certainly. I was asked actually earlier this year by two visiting think tankers from Washington about sort of what the discussion in Finland is on sort of what would be acceptable from a Finnish point of view as an outcome, and would it be okay if Crimea would be left with Russia? What about the Donbass and so on? And I was like almost at a loss for an answer because we don't publicly really discuss that. That hasn't been the case. And now within the space of a few days after the election result came out, snap, the whole debate has shifted, and we have people in positions openly now talking about sort of that all along it's been clear that the outcome is not going to be entirely according to Ukraine's wishes. So I think it's a dramatic change in the debate, and just because of the anticipation of Trump coming, and with our president saying, for example, there's a window of opportunity now, an opening now for peace negotiations before Trump actually is inaugurated. So we're talking about the next weeks, essentially. So this is quite a shift in the tone. Now to go back sort of to what this means for Finland and how we view it in Finland and the Nordic region more generally. As several people already alluded to, of course, the Finnish security position has been very different. The position of Finland in general and the post-war era has been very different from Norway certainly and Denmark as well. We have not been super Atlanticists, to put it mildly. And we had a period where we were in a very precarious situation with the Soviet Union. There was talk of the Nordic balance, you remember maybe from the 60s and 70s, where Finland was left in a bit of a gray zone in a forced position of neutrality. It wasn't the kind of neutrality that Sweden had. It was something that we were not maybe, now in retrospect, very comfortable with, but it was the best we could do at the time. Then we had a period of military non-alignment, but the general trend was to go as far as we could in integrating with the Western institutions, with the EU, becoming EU members, and building very close ties to the US and NATO without being actually formal allies. So, partners, but not formal allies. And an early sign of that, of course, was that we bought US fighters already in the early 90s, the Hornets. And we bought, for example, JASM missiles that were sold by the US only to a very few select group of security allies already before the NATO membership. But what is really symptomatic, I think, of the long sort of approach of Finland to our security is that we have for more than 200 years been both extremely pragmatic and extremely agile as well. So when situations shift, we're very quick to shift from being, 600 years with Sweden. All of a sudden, we're Tsarist, loyal sort of citizens of a Grand Duchy in the Tsarist Empire. We had a similar kind of shift when we became independent, again after the Second World War, after the end of the Cold War, and now we saw the latest one with the invasion of Ukraine, and within very short period of time, we switched to, okay, we have to join NATO. And as far as I understand and read the situation, we basically pulled Sweden along and said, we're going with you, hopefully with you, but we go also without you if you hesitate. So we've been very quick with this, and this is also, I think, very symptomatic of what you see now. So now we are, lo and behold, we are Atlanticists. This is everywhere now in Finland. So we have become almost like Denmark now, and we very much emphasize now the security ties with the US. We have very few, if any. Actually, I don't think we have almost any limitations now to how far we are ready to go with the NATO membership and with our bilateral security ties with the US, DCA and so on. So just I think. Was it yesterday or just recently they signed what they call the ICE Pact between the US and Canada and Finland, developing icebreakers, because I think the US has one icebreaker right currently, so that's something that we can contribute to the US. So we're very much underlying and emphasizing to the Trump administration what we can do for you. basically. We buy a lot of what I guess President-elect Trump would say, beautiful American fighters, beautiful American missiles, and so on. We spend a lot of money buying military equipment from the US right now. And we're opening up our bases to place US forces and US equipment, pre-position them, and so on. Very, very frequent military rehearsals with US forces and so on. So, I think, Christine, you said it there yourself, that all the Nordics probably have been quite pragmatic, not taking really a side officially on which candidate would be preferable. So we work in those ties also to the people who are not just the president-elect himself, but also the people working around him to have a very strong sort of personal ties already beforehand and making sure of that. But I still see that we're in a very precarious environment, certainly when it comes to Ukraine. And roughly speaking, it seems to me that we have a group of countries now that broadly share the view that this is a very serious thing. We need to take it seriously. I'm talking here about the Nordic countries, the Baltics, Poland, and the UK. And then we have a lot of other countries. So Germany does a lot better, are a bit ambivalent about it. But we have a bit of an issue if the US withdraws support from Ukraine or is less sort of tied to this to the NATO structures, and ambivalent about Article 5 as well. We're going to have a bit of a problem. And just finally on that issue I alluded to in the beginning, I mean the China thing. So I think this is also something that we need to pay much attention to, because the US security focus will be very much on China now. So it cannot but impact also us in many ways. And I think we need to prepare for a lot of perhaps unlikely, but certainly not impossible scenarios that might come up in the second Trump presidency. How are we going to respond to, for example, a military contingency with Taiwan? The US demanding, as you heard before, that we do more there on economic security, or if there's a change in sort of how the US relates to Taiwan, and then demands that allied countries should also do something along those lines. We need to think through a lot of different kinds of scenarios. Yeah, maybe I'll stop at that.
So a quick follow-up question to you as well. You mentioned how Finland has been pragmatic and sort of followed, done what it has needed to do at different phases. At the same time, I remember your former president, Sauli Niinistö, he was also referring to Finland's trademark as "we never put our guard down" in terms of the relationship with Russia, and how Finland has been very central in building up national defense, total defense as well. Do you see this changing now that Finland has become a member of NATO, or is this still a very strong sentiment in the Finnish population that in the end we have to defend ourselves?
I think it's a great relief that we're not alone. The fear for Finns, of course, has been all the time that we will be left out alone in the cold, and because we have some experience of that. So it's a very deeply ingrained thing that is really in the spine, in the backbone of every Finn. And I've said kind of as a metaphor that it's a little bit like we have it in our spine, and it's this kind of crisis mode that kicks in, and that's what happened in February 2022. That within weeks, everybody realized what this is. Everybody could see that Ukraine now could be Finland as well. So we really had this dramatic shift from a very solid, only 20% plus minus a few. It was about 20% support for NATO membership for decades. It was around that 20-25, maybe tops 30% at some point, and it shifted within a few weeks to 80% in favor, and that was really like snap, and everybody turns and marches in the same direction. And I think that was a little bit okay. Sweden was fairly quick as well, but a little bit different context, because it's not maybe as sort of concretely felt due to different historical trajectories. This fear that there is. So we do, of course. I mean, everything has been on hyperdrive, you could say. Now, the last couple of years, not just working within NATO, all the bilateral securities in the Nordic context, but also unilaterally. We do just about everything we can now. As I said earlier in this year, when I was talking in another event in Switzerland, I said that we're essentially preparing for war now. So that's the situation.
Thank you. We are going to open up for questions not long from now. I am going to ask you all a question before we do that I'll invite you to respond to. But I realized that I don't see a clock from my position, so I'm going to need a helper. And I'm looking at you, Ole Jakob. You can help me when it is time for questions from the audience. So the question I would invite you all to talk about is one that has to do with sort of the Nordic comparative advantage, because internationally the Nordics often pride themselves both in terms of the Nordic societal model, which has been something that has been looked to by other countries. It's free speech, it's democracy, it's all these values that the Nordics often are said to share. And at the same time, the Nordics also pride themselves of being very staunch supporters of the so-called rules-based international order. And the Nordics are, interested in and investing in multilateralist agreements. They are also take pride in being at the forefront of these institutions and often also trying to speak the value of those. At the same time, and as you said, Mikael, I think the description of the Nordics being pragmatists and being good at sort of playing under the conditions that they are facing, I think that's also something that's shared by the Nordics. And I think one of you mentioned hedging as well as something that you have to engage in at times as you are small countries in the world. How do you see the Nordics, and I'm going to start with you, Björn, how do you see the Nordics balancing this, on the one hand, very strong interest in upholding the rules-based international order, and at the same time playing along with this other order that seems to be developing, not just because of Trump, but he will, or is perhaps likely to, as Ida Marie also mentioned in her introduction, likely to amplify that order where you have different rules of the game.
Well, I mean, I think you manifest here the dilemma for the Nordics. We have one order that we would clearly benefit from and excel at and working towards, but we have a totally different trend in international relations. I guess, one positive is that at least now the Nordics have more of a common base, because even though we are similar on a societal level, I've heard historians explain it with that we've always had like free farmers in our country. We don't have a feudal tradition, etc. Strong society that comes from kind of small-scale individual freedom. Anyway, but apart from that, we've been very different. It's actually quite, for many years, it was hard to find a region that was so different in terms of the currency you trade with, the military alliances you establish, how you organize your foreign policy, etc. But now, the last years, we've seen a convergence with the Danes opting in on EU defense cooperation, Sweden and Finland joining NATO. I don't know about Norway. You might join us at some point. But at large, we are increasingly the members of the same clubs, which of course opens up for more collaboration. And I think we try, at least on an economic sense, but also on foreign policy, together with the Baltics, to uphold and to manifest ourselves as a bloc, policy-wise. But as we've already heard, we also have this tendency, of course, to try to strike bilateral deals. We'd be curious to have the Finnish perspective, the ICE agreement, like the AUKUS of the Arctic, I heard someone call it. Is there a discussion in Finland if this is a trade-off, like when you should go it alone and when not? I know that both Sweden and Finland, they have bilateral 6G deals with the US, essentially one for Ericsson and one for Nokia. We could have done that together, maybe. Perhaps we could have even done it as the Nordics. So there is this tendency of, at some days, we are Nordic, but quite often we are just nation states trying to put forward our own interests. And I think we can't really avoid that dilemma, really.
Thank you. Andreas, any thoughts on this? You mentioned the Danish membership of the UN Security Council, so this is also something that I assume is very much on the mind of Danish policymakers.
It is. I think I would start by saying that this international rules-based order has been the number one priority from a Danish perspective all along. I think the past 6 Danish foreign policy strategy papers put it up front and center. So given that we are witnessing a new Trump administration, and we know that he's so disruptive, I think that's one thing we should also put out there. I mean, his first act in his last term was to abandon the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was on his first day in office. He left the Paris Agreement. He abandoned also the INF, nuclear arms armament agreement. He left the UNESCO, and also the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal agreement. So it's just to say that he's a very disruptive force, and I think that's very concerning from a Danish perspective. How we are going to maintain this multilateral rules-based order that we rely on as a small state with an open economy. A Nordic perspective, I think that Danes have actually been very keen, as Björn also alluded to, from a Swedish perspective, to do the bilateralism as well. I mean, we pride ourselves, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, about being the only country among the Nordics to be a comprehensive strategic partner of China. We also have prided ourselves of having this special relationship with Washington. But it's true that the trend lines have been more favorable in terms of having a more Nordic perspective from Copenhagen, and it's true that that since we gave up the opt-out of EU defense arrangements, and since Sweden and Finland joined the NATO, we could work more jointly in that regard, as well as in others. And we do still see the other Nordic countries as the most like-minded countries, possibly together with the Baltic countries. So there's something to build on there, but in the end of the day, I think Danes are pragmatists in their backbone, and will, as I said in my opening remarks, follow the whims and wishes of a new Trump administration. Thank you.
Anita Maria, you mentioned that should the multilateral security arrangements not function as well as they do currently, then bilateralism is kind of what one turns to. What is your thoughts on the rules-based international order?
Oh, that's a difficult question. Could I comment on the comparative advantage instead?
Yes, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. My head is wrapped around other questions right now. Well, I just felt like saying that there is a unique comparative advantage for the Nordics now in that the main hurdles for strengthening their defense cooperation that will contribute to all of the state security has been removed. But let's not forget that although they share a similar strategic outlook, it's not identical, with Norway focusing on the challenges in the high north, and Sweden and Finland, correct me if I'm wrong, but focusing more on the Baltic Sea region. So that is a dissimilarity. And I think we also should remember that there have been cooperation difficulties in areas such as joint procurement that cannot be explained by different alignment status, but maybe due to bureaucratic hurdles. We might see also in this bilateral attention path that defense industrial competition may arise, and so on. So there are great opportunities, but also some risks involved in this. And yes, just to say that Norway is, of course, a firm supporter of rules-based international order, being a core Norwegian security interest as a small state. And I think that overall, more dilemmas can present present itself for Norway and other Nordic nations in balancing the need to be a loyal ally, and at the same time we may have ever-growing reasons to be skeptical to whether US is longer the loyal and benign ally. So yes.
Thank you. Okay.
I think it was embedded in your question already, and already in the use of the term, because the rules-based international order is it's a political term. It's not the same as international law. And there's some interesting discussion, recent discussion among international lawyers or legal scholars on this term. And by using this, what you're signifying is basically we belong to this group and we're with the US. But what is the difference between rules-based international order and international law? Is that it's a little bit more of a pick and mix. I mean, it's a carve out basically for exceptions to that, with especially two notable areas. One is that there are a number of agreements that the US itself has not ratified, for example, or as we heard before, is withdrawing from certain institutions and so on. And the other obvious exception would be with regards to what is happening in the Middle East and particularly Israel. So this by using the rules-based international order instead of international law, that means that you're kind of signaling this and you leave that space for exceptions to that. So and I think we're facing now very much the consequences, the problems of this. It would have been maybe more clear initially also with the Russian aggression to just talk about international law and the UN Charter. It's easier to get the majority of states behind that, because a lot of states most states still are quite embedded or sort of okay with the UN system and with the UN Charter and with international law. But when you talk about this, then you start excluding people, and you get a small group of like-minded countries that are maybe 50 countries in the world. But we're seeing now why it's a big problem, because essentially we lost the Ukraine narrative. I think partly because of this, because the rules-based order is also very much something that a lot of people outside of our group see as double standards, right? We treat countries differently. For us, Ukraine is very important, but then there's other things that we don't talk so much about now, and those other things tend to be a bigger issue for quote unquote global South. So I think it's not unproblematic to use this term.
And that's an excellent question to pick up on, and I'll go the other direction now and ask you a follow-up question first, because back in the 60s, there was this talk about the Nordic balance, right? And the Nordic balance was essentially that the Nordic countries had different security outlooks, and then their choices ended up balancing each other in the region as a whole. So they chose differently, and that meant that the region stayed peaceful, was the theory. Today, many, I think, would say that the Nordics are much more aligned, also due to the recent choices of Sweden and Finland to join NATO, which makes sort of the alliance setup more similar in the region as well. But since you mentioned the double standards, you mentioned the criticism, and you mentioned these tensions, and also because we are at a seminar organized by the Center for Geopolitics, I wanted to ask you, and some of you have alluded to this already, but the question of Russia and China in this, and including the relations of the Trump administration with these states. Are the Nordics, in your view, and starting with you, Mikael, are they aligned in the question of how to approach Russia and China as other strong states, actors in the international system? What, in your view, would be the differences as seen from a Finnish point of view?
It's a good question. I mean, they got sort of, I guess, lumped together, for better or worse, with the invasion. So the public perception and view on China shifted dramatically because of the invasion. Because to put it kind of very simply, to us it looked like, okay, this is an invasion of a country very close to us. We can very much relate to how that we feel if we see ourselves in the position of the Ukrainians. China is friends with Russia. They're at least indirectly supporting Russia. So that's a major issue for us. And as long as that is there, we have a big problem with that. So they got sort of put together in the same category as Russia and China are more or less the same, which sometimes even, I mean, in terms of just looking at what is happening, is kind of intriguing and interesting that people sometimes seem to be even more concerned about China than about Russia in Finland. It's kind of strange in a way, but this is the way it's gone. So in that sense, we have definitely had a big shift in the public perception, and a lot of talk about sort of, okay, so how strong is that Russia-China link? But I think it's from a scholar's point of view, it's much more complex. That both what China is aiming at, how China is operating, is quite different from Russia. What they actually are, and also that relationship is far more complex, I think, than people usually make it out to be.
Thank you. Ida-Maria, I'm going to ask you to comment on this as well. But while the rest of the panel speaks, please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question in the end. I have seen you, Øyvind, and there are a couple of other hands as well. So Ida-Maria, please share your thoughts if you have any on this subject.
Yes, Norway's approach to the China challenge is definitely way different than its perception of the challenge stemming from Russia. Russia is defined as the main threat to Norwegian security, whilst in the case of Norway's approach to China, also the economic opportunities are stressed, but on the other hand, a de-risking approach is emphasized that shall be aligned with national and allied interests. So I think first and foremost, it's an adaptation to perceived US expectations, while also stressing that Norway should reduce its vulnerability by seeking to have a similar approach as the Nordic and EU. Yes.
Thank you. Andreas?
Yes, so I would focus on China, obviously. I would say that during the 2000s and 2010s, the Nordic countries were not at all aligned in how they were approaching China. So it was sort of a beauty contest. We all wanted to cultivate good ties with the Beijing. And I think that golden era came to an abrupt end in 2018, 2019 maybe. The Trump administration launched its trade war, changed the economic dynamics to a zero-sum game. We had an increased level of Chinese repression. We saw the Hong Kong protest, the Xinjiang genocide, as at least the Americans would refer to the US Congress. And so perceptions among the Nordic countries all changed quite dramatically and sort of in alignment. But I would also stress that some of the Nordic countries have been, moving faster than others. So Denmark, for instance, has been a first mover, I would say, in many regards, including the Huawei topic that I brought up in my opening remarks. But also more recently, Mette Frederiksen, our prime minister, was very vocal in an interview she gave to the Politico magazine. She really called out China for its support for Russia in its war in Ukraine in a way that was unheard of on the European continent. She was very specific, and I think that at least in the recent years, Denmark has been very keen on following the U.S. approach towards China and be very specific in its criticism of China on many accounts, and I think that's at least one way that the Danish government sort of is an exception to this Nordic alignment that has been occurring over the past few years when it comes to our perceptions of China.
Thank you. Björn?
Yeah, well, as I said in my introduction, there's a bit of a Swedish dilemma here that we want to be loyal to the Americans when in their relation to China, but it goes against our either free trade principles or hard kind of trade interests, if you want. But I agree with the fact, I mean, that we see much more alignment among the Nordics today. I think as a principle, possibly we are more inclined to be critical to China on a human rights basis, while being slightly softer on kind of trade and the economic security mechanism. And that worked okay with the Biden administration. Would probably worked pretty well with the Kamala Harris administration, but not so good with the Trump administration, who's less focused on human rights and much more focused on the hard economic security measures. So we might need to adopt there. But in general, I would say that the Nordics, I mean, especially if you compare with a decade ago or something, are very aligned. Also, I would just like to put up like the demand side of politics. I mean, in a few years' time, if we look at the relation to Russia and the situation in Ukraine, Ukraine is on its way towards EU membership. And this is a process that kind of moves on regardless of what we think on a daily basis. At some point, of course, the member states will have to have a say, but they are approaching EU membership. If we have a US administration, definitely for 4 years, but perhaps later on, that do not want to see Ukraine as members of NATO, we have a pretty challenging situation, because the EU has never kind of enlarged into territory that is kind of under geopolitical press in that sense, if NATO didn't expand before. So in that situation, we would either have to, the European Union will have to cater for the security dimensions of Ukraine, or we will have to solve that as Europeans in some kind of coalition of the willings. And I think in both of these scenarios, there would be valid calls for the Nordics to make a considerable contribution to that security provision. And I think that will also be a factor that will even more align us on this fact, because I think we have similar preferences there.
Thank you, Björn. So we have some questions. I have 3 on my list. The list is still open. We can start at the front there.
Øyvind Svendsen from NUPI. Good morning. Thank you for an insightful discussion so far. I have 2 questions, and they're both in the spirit of looking at the crystal ball, by the way, just to say that. You talk about Nordic agility and pragmatism, but you don't talk about Nordic dependencies. And I think dependencies on the US is very important here. And that leads to Nordic policies of, sitting in the boat, hoping that this will go well. You talk about Nordics being prepared, but of course, there is a big worry that the US will withdraw from security cooperation, economic cooperation, and multilateral cooperation. So I guess my question is about, the first one is about worst case scenarios, because there's a lot of potential for Nordic hypocrisy in the coming years. We mentioned Ukraine, but also on trade, on Southeast Asia. And not to speak of the Middle East, which we haven't talked too much about. Is there anything that Trump could do that would lead the Nordics to actually break ranks and not just sit still and hope that this will blow over? And the second one is a specific Nordic challenge. If Donald Trump comes into office and contributes and facilitates a negotiated peace agreement in Ukraine, should he win the Nobel Peace Prize?
Okay, maybe we should start with that question and allow you to respond to it before we move on. So who would like to go first? Maybe Andreas, I'll challenge you on this one first. As the super Atlanticist representative in the panel.
But, not a Nordic expert. But I think I did stress in my own opening remarks that Denmark is very dependent on the US in so many respects. I mean, not just security-wise, but also economically. It's our largest trading partner, biggest FDI investor and all that. Technologically, I mean, you can't open a program these days that is not brought to you by a US tech company, right? So in that sense, and given talks that I've had with confidential sources, I would say that we are willing to go very far to the whims and wishes of a Trump administration. I don't see any specific scenario that would make Copenhagen say, you crossed the line. But I mean, he already was, as I alluded to before, a disruptor in the first term, and we still stuck to the traditional line, right? So you should have given us a specific example and asked us if that would be crossing the line from a Nordic perspective. But given how he's picking his candidates right now, I see his second term moving in a much more radical direction than the first term. And given that, I won't, exclude any scenario that would make Denmark say this is one step too far.
What about the Peace Prize?
Peace what?
The Peace Prize.
Peace Prize?
Yeah, the second question was.
But I think he's pretty sure that he will be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
Big problem for you if you don't give it to him.
But it's the Norwegian government, I heard, that is deciding this, right? Sorry about that. At least the Chinese thinks it's the Norwegian government.
Thank you for that response. Mikael, is there a limit to Finnish pragmatism in terms of, is there anything Trump could do to cross the red line?
When we had formally become members of NATO, an American colleague of mine said congratulations, and you may end up being the shortest member of the alliance. And now, fortunately, Sweden will be even shorter if that happens. Well, I asked this question related to Article 5. How can you be certain? I mean, this was like early this year. I asked it from American experts. How can we be certain that Article 5 will hold also during Trump? Well, they asked back how much you're spending on military. I said the figure, and he said, yeah, you're fine, you're safe. So I guess on that side, I don't know. But what I've been actually also pondering recently is that one very tricky issue would be if, you've all heard about this project, 2025, whatever, if that actually would be sort of put in place, and if that would entail starting to dismantle some of the institutions, the democratic institutions, or subverting them from inside or whatever, that would be a really tricky question. I still don't expect us to go with a pragmatic way there and just become very hypercritical. And unfortunately, that's probably the most likely outcome in the current security environment. But it would be very, very tricky for the Nordic countries how we deal with that kind of situation. On the Peace Prize, well, they awarded it to former President Obama right at the start. So I guess there's a precedent for that.
Björn, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about this dichotomy between breaking ranks and being pragmatic. I think the most Nordic thing is to be pragmatic and hedge against what you see as kind of possibly disturbing policies. So not really breaking ranks, but using your rank to find different solutions. And from an EU perspective, again, we spent the last time when Trump was president with actually establishing more EU defense measures that would both work as a kind of a plan A of supplying NATO with more resources, but possibly also plan B of having a framework of action if NATO was not available or the EU was not willing to contribute. And I think we will see the same kind of hedging policies now, but not with any kind of dramatic rank breaking. And the Swedes are slightly more shy than the Finns, funny enough. We don't talk about strategic autonomy and use these big words, but in practice, we are also part of an EU movement to establish more kind of venues and platforms for activity that could be useful. So I think that is a sort of a hedging policy, and we most likely will see more of that. We see it in the defense industrial realm, where for decades you would hear Swedish, both the Ministry of Defense or the industry say like, well, we don't want to see anything happening in the EU that would kind of threaten the transatlantic link of Swedish defense industry, which is hugely invested in the US and in the UK, and we have ownership from the UK and the US in our industry. But just the 5 years, the tone has been totally different. You hear the CEO of Saab going around in Europe and sounding almost French, saying like, well, we can't have it this way that the Europeans buy 80% of their kit from, or 70% from the Americans. We need to buy European, preferably Saab. It's a totally different kind of tonality. And I think that is also an example of a kind of a hedging strategy, or just to follow the money strategy. We're actually investing quite a lot within the EU right now.
Ida Maria, would you like to comment?
Yes, should Trump win the Nobel Prize? Well, I definitely hope not, because I think that any Trump deal would involve some form of serious concessions, territorial or sovereignty-wise, at Ukraine's expense. And that is, by the way, a continued firm stance in the Norwegian authorities' debate as well, that would be a really difficult scenario for the future of European security. So it's interesting to hear that the Finnish debate has changed somewhat. So that's one comment. And is there a limit to Norwegian pragmatism? I fear there might not be, or I am not able to envisage such a scenario, because it's a matter of national survival. And as long as there aren't a perception that there are any viable alternatives, then I think, and the pragmatism will stay intact.
I have 3 questions on my list, and I'll unfortunately have to close the list there, just because we are running out of time. The first question is at the back there. Then we have one over here and one here. And we'll take them together, and then I'll invite you to respond to the things that you feel most interested in responding to or capable of.
Yep. We heard a lot, and everyone seemed to agree on that one of the positive outcome of the Trump election is that we became much more aware that it is now time to strengthen Europe. So my question is more for Norway. Is it a problem for Norway, or won't it be a good time for Norway to finally join Europe? And especially when Trump is making friends with Orban, because we didn't talk a lot about that, but which also represent a serious threat for Europe.
Thank you. There was a question over here as well. Yeah, I think it was you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Dora Lloyd. I'm the deputy head of the Hungarian embassy. So I didn't raise my hand to reflect on this last question, but I will nevertheless. I think we have to, like all of you said, cooperate with whoever is in the US administration. And thank you very much for this intriguing overview. It's very interesting for us to see the different perspectives from the Scandinavian countries. My original question to you was concerning the High North, the Arctic. This is something that I didn't see very much reflected in the campaign of Trump, but you are much more knowledgeable on this, so I would really like to know your views on how to proceed on this. I have seen it in relation to Alaska, perhaps, but not anything else. So, and one of you, I think it was the Norwegian scholar who mentioned that Sweden and Finland are more oriented towards the Baltics, while the other 2 of you is more the Atlantic, High North, sort of geographically. So I would love to hear your views on this area. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final question here.
Thank you. My name is Mariam Sugaipova. I'm with NUPI as well. I have a very specific question to Björn and Andreas, because following what Mikael said about Finnish debate on the conditions of potential peace talk between Russia and Ukraine and possibility of losing territory, the 20% territory occupied by Russia, what are the public debates in Sweden and Denmark about these opportunities and conditions, acceptable conditions for Denmark and Sweden of possible peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in academia, or just like specifically in the public as well? Because as Ida Maria mentioned, in Norway it's still very much taboo, and if it is discussed, it's discussed in a very specific closed forums. So it would be just interesting to learn from Denmark and Sweden especially. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have three very relevant questions, I would say. One relates to European cooperation and specifically the question of Norway. The other scholars in the panel, you can choose whether you want to reflect on that or not.
You're welcome.
And we have a question about the High North and how that looks in the current situation and under the new presidency. And then we have a final question about the possibility of peace talks and what will happen in the context of Ukraine. So let's go in the opposite order that we started. We'll go with you, Mikael, and if you want to add some concluding remarks, you can do that at the same time.
Well, I felt most of the questions are not directly related to me, but I was thinking this high north question. It's true that we are perhaps in Finland a little bit more focused on the Baltic Sea region, but on the other hand, it's more complex than that because I mean a lot of the talk now within the NATO framework in the US, Finland sort of bilateral security cooperation, and also in the Nordic sphere is very much related to the Finnish Lapland, of course, and having troops from Sweden, for example, based in the Finnish Lapland. This is for very historical reasons. I mean, in the Winter War, pretty much we needed the Swedish 1/3 of the Swedish Air Force there to secure it. Continuation war, we had 300,000 Germans there, and the same. Probably, I guess, in the future as well, you still need to secure that, even though the brunt of a thing might be in the Baltic region, but the North is very important for us as well. And that aspect that I mentioned is sort of building also on the cooperation in the Arctic sphere and Arctic marine technology, where we are fairly strong, I guess, at least in icebreakers. So that's just as a
Any thoughts on the peace talk question?
Yeah, no, I'm still amazed at how quickly it shifted the Finnish debate. So because it's really the last few, we're talking 3, 4, 5 days that we've had a lot of prominent people now talking in completely new ways about it. So I'm still sort of pondering myself also how quickly this went and what this signifies. Of course, no. I mean, you said which conditions would be acceptable. I think. None of these are really acceptable to Finland. It's just that it's coming out is what a lot of experts have been talking privately in close settings, as you were referring to, that realistically, if you're losing on the battlefield, you usually don't get to set the terms of how it ends, and this is just that pragmatic realization is now coming out into the open, but it's still a very bad thing for Finland and for other Nordics as well, I think.
Thank you. Ida Maria?
Yes, I can comment on the European question and Norway. I don't think there's any sign suggesting that Norway will vouch for membership anytime soon. But it's kind of surprising, though, that there's not a revival of EU debate even in Norway, which I think would be timely. I think there is a fear of any competition in terms of the military security role. And for Norway, it's important to stress that NATO is the military security provider. But on the other hand, Norway has a range of cooperation areas with European Union and seems to think that they are working okay. They recently emphasized the new security and defense agreement, basically just summing up the different areas of cooperation. Yes, and a quick comment on the High North versus Baltic Sea issue. I think, although there are some differences in geographical focus, there is also increased recognition that the High North and the Baltic Sea region is interconnected, and the region as such is one operational theater in military terms. So, yes.
Thank you. Andreas?
Yes, so to begin with, I'm not aware of any new developments in the Danish policy debate about peace talks in Ukraine. I can tell you that our Prime Minister is a staunch Zelensky supporter, and she would say that it's up to Ukraine to define the right parameters for discussing a peace settlement with Russia. But things are moving quickly, as Michael is telling us, so maybe if you ask me next week, it will be different. But on the high north, and I'm not an expert again on this, but I can tell you that Danes were very heavily invested in the notion of Arctic exceptionalism, the notion that we should cooperate the Arctic 5 countries, or Arctic 8, depending on how expanded a view you are putting on this, and there would be no security dynamics. So it's been really a wake-up call for the Danish government, what's been happening since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how they have been left out of the council. And so the most recent defense agreement targets or earmarks a lot of funding for investing in capabilities that will enable Denmark to rearm its Arctic presence, given that Greenland is part of the Danish kingdom. So we will have new capabilities for monitoring and also being far more present in the Arctic area going forward. So this is a dramatic change of the Danish perspective on the high north, I can tell you. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Björn, and then you'll have a final word as well. You want to say something about the Norwegian EU membership?
Related, yes.
Okay, I go first. On the EU membership, I think for Norway, I think you have a situation that is similar to our NATO partnership for many years. We were not free riders. We actually paid almost the full price in terms of money, adaptation of our society. We didn't get the full kind of goods back, but we were happy with that. We thought it was a price worth paying until 2 years ago, something when there was a geopolitical premium and we changed our mind. So maybe under some geopolitical or geoeconomic pressure, you will also reach some kind of threshold where it's worth being full members and not just paying non-members. But that's up to you. On the kind of Arctic and Baltic, I think that's true in a kind of strict NATO perspective. Sweden and Finland have, and especially Sweden, a full focus on the Baltic. Also when we look at command structures, etc., and that is our role. But from a wider foreign policy perspective, we are very much invested in the Arctic. And I mean, Sweden moves a big portion of our GDP through the train to Narvik and then out on the coast and sea lines. So we are very much engaged in that policy. And I also think from a military sense, for example, like air defense situated on a boat in the very north of the Baltic would also cover a big part of the Arctic theater, for example. So there's lots of interrelationships between these theaters. And also when it comes to space, for example, it is as relevant for the Arctic. So we are very much engaged there. Finally, we have the same situation, I think, as in the other countries we've heard. It's been almost taboo to have a discussion about kind of more likely scenarios. We've been very much focused on the preferred outcome of a full Ukrainian victory, and anything else has been not relevant to discuss in the public domain. And we are only now kind of waking up both to the realities on the battleground, but also the possible policies of Trump, or that we will be faced with some kind of agreement that he does with Putin, and we will have to say yes or no. And then we are back to this pragmatism. How close do we want to stay to the Americans in comparison to loyalty to the Ukrainians? But this will also be interesting to see from a kind of political science perspective. We've heard our politicians talk about this in a very kind of ideational way, like this is the only way we can perceive the future, and then after a few weeks of change they'll have to sell another concept. But I think one outcome, if that is what we're heading towards, some sort of de facto partition, whether it's part of a deal with Americans or not, we would probably see Sweden, and I think the Nordics, see this as still a kind of a necessary or an evil necessary, but we would continue to press for a price to be paid by Russia. There must be consequences for this, so it would affect future trade ties, for example. But you would definitely see other European countries say like, okay, now we have a deal, we fixed this, let's go back to normal. We want to buy more cheap gas, we want to sell our what we now sell. So it would risk quite, I think, substantial rifts in European politics, and in that case, it would be good if the Nordics at least could stay united.
Thank you. 30 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, I did actually write 20 years ago an article on under what conditions Norway would become a member. But anyway, that's a long oral history. I wanted actually to just chip in because it just struck my mind that there was this report by a former president who just stepped down, President Niinistö, who was commissioned by the Ursula von der Leyen to write about the EU civil and military preparedness. And what I think is interesting about that is that because he, with President Macron, had been one of the few talking about European defense before, and it kind of seemed that he played down this EU role here very much, which is interesting because we might think that it's the member states are not ready to give the EU more of a role in that sphere. That's how we could read it. So.
Thank you. I want to thank you for being part of this panel, and thank you for also accepting the invitation to look into the crystal ball. It's not all political science scientists' favorite exercise, but I think you shared with us many interesting and good thoughts today. Maybe we should meet again in 4 years, do the same seminar, and see if our reflections held. I want to thank the audience for engaging and for asking very good questions to our panelists. So please help me give them a hand for today's performance.